Hello, everybody, and welcome to History Bite number 238, dated April 25th, 2021. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. This History Bite is entitled The Supreme Court Appointments of President George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, we all are quite aware that the first President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, served as the 41st President of the United States of America from January 20th, 1989 until January 20th, 1993. Okay? And during his single term in the White House, President Bush appointed two men to the Supreme Court of the United States. In doing so, he replaced these two following judicial legends. First, U.S. Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan, Jr., who had been appointed to the court in 1956 by President Dwight Eisenhower. And second, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was, of course, the court's very first African-American justice. Marshall had been appointed to the court in 1967 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Okay? Marshall and Brennan were a dynamic duo, whose close retirements reflected their decades-long friendship on the court. It goes without saying that once Brennan left the court first in 1990, Marshall's departure the following year, was almost a given. All right, the two were stuck like glue, aces all the way. All right, each other's support, if you will. And so it's, legendary that, although they joined the court almost a decade apart from one another, their departures, were right next to one another. So that's how it is sometimes. And of course, politics always plays the supreme role, as well as health once you get past the age of 80. So President Bush's first opportunity to appoint a Supreme Court justice came with the retirement of Justice William J. Brennan, Jr. in July 1990, specifically July 20th of 1990, which was my 5th birthday. Yes, I'm old, I know. Okay. So, Justice Brennan had suffered a stroke in summer of 1990, and at that point he was 84 years old. Not the best age, to have a stroke. And, even though he did not want to step down from the court during a Republican administration, his health carried the day, and ultimately he gave into it and submitted his resignation to President Bush. Brennan had served on the court for 34 years at that point. All right. To replace Justice Brennan on the Supreme Court, all right, Brennan, the liberal lion, by the way, Justice Brennan. We'll get to him more. It's covered in the video about President Eisenhower's appointments. But to replace the liberal lion, Justice William J. Brennan, Jr., okay, President Bush considered 5 individuals, okay, Judges Edith Jones, Lawrence Silberman, Clarence Thomas, David Suter, as well as attorney Kenneth Starr. All right. So of these candidates, surprisingly, it may surprise all of you that Clarence Thomas was his favorite to replace Justice Brennan. But interestingly, some things worked against Thomas, which in reviewing and doing my homework, one of the things that worked against him, which I found to be rather ironic, was the fact that if Thomas were appointed to the court in 1990, that would give the court 2 African-American justices when there were only 9 seats on the court. As if that's a big problem. I mean, nobody said anything when it was 9 white justices with 9 seats on the court. So 2 African-American justices out of 9 seats is not even half. So what's the problem? All right. But anyway, not to split hairs, I just found that to be interesting. But another reason for the opposition of Thomas at that point was he was too young and had only recently been appointed to the D.C. Court of Appeals earlier in the year, so he just wasn't ready yet in the minds of many of Bush's advisors. Thomas was only in his early 40s at this point. So, plus President Bush really wanted to save him for Thurgood Marshall's retirement, one black justice for another, so to speak. All right. So, that pretty much took Thomas out the selection for the replacement of Brennan. Judges Wilson and Silberman, were thought to be, much too conservative and controversial to replace someone like Brennan in the political climate of 1990 anyway. Kenneth Starr, really wasn't seriously considered. So ultimately, Bush would center on U.S. Court of Appeals judge for the First Circuit, David Suter. All right. Now, Suter himself, like Thomas, had only been on the U.S. Court of Appeals for a few months that year, specifically in May. So, but unlike Thomas, Suter was about a decade older than Thomas. Suter was in his early 50s at that point. Thomas was only in his early 40s. So, that certainly helps you, this experience. Okay. Also, unlike Thomas, Suter, prior to his appointment to the U.S. Court of Appeals, had served as a state judge in New Hampshire for several years prior to his appointment to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. All right. He had served as both a trial judge in New Hampshire and a member of the state Supreme Court. So Suter certainly had judicial experience in his background. And I'll add for the record that David Suter, to date, was the last U.S. Supreme Court justice, the most recent, rather, to have any state court experience, prior to arriving at the U.S. Supreme Court. All right? No members since have had any experience serving as a state judge. This is priceless of in itself. So, in addition to that, Suter had also served as Attorney General of New Hampshire. He had a lot of backing from New Hampshire politicians. He was viewed as a traditional New England conservative, which is not hardcore, radical right-wing, but certainly consistent, in conservative beliefs. And because he had not been on the First Circuit for very long, his opponents didn't really have much to use against him, all right? As they say, all things are yin and yang. So the lack of a paper trail helped him just as much as it hurt him. So while they couldn't really have much to use against him, it helped him, with that regard, that because we don't really know where this guy stands on certain issues, that could be a good thing, his primary criticism of Suter in that regard was, he doesn't have much time on the First Circuit for us to evaluate his judicial philosophy, So opponents used that thing in particular, whereas his supporters had argued, because he does not have a long paper trail, trust us. He's a conservative, He's demonstrated his conservatism when he was a state judge, all right? So precisely what we needed was somebody who was confirmable, all right? And because Suter didn't have a paper trail, he was known as the stealth justice, flying under the radar, all right? He was confirmable, he wasn't a Robert Bork, although some people called him Robert Bork in disguise, so that was totally untrue. And he was, for all intents and purposes, a moderate, someone who could easily win the approval of both Democratic and Republican senators. All right. So with that, Suter would be, nominated by President Bush 4 days later on July 24th, 1990. And like I said, the primary fuel that his opponents had to use against Suter was the fact that he didn't really have much of a long judicial paper trail to follow, So they we don't really know what we're getting here. But his supporters were like, pretty much lack of paper trail, really is a good thing. As you know, this guy certainly has the ability to perhaps be what you think he will be, all right, in a good way. All right. So you don't really have much to use against him here. It's a good thing he doesn't have a paper trail, that way he's not controversial. He can pass through, ultimately. So, his opponents ultimately were defeated, Not that there was much opposition to him to begin with, but his supporters would carry the day, as Suter would be confirmed to the Supreme Court in October of 1990 by a 90-9 vote. All right. And the senators who ultimately voted against him, all Democratic senators, by the way, cited their opposition to Suter's nomination as, a lack of ability to truly trace and trust his jurisprudence. Like I said, he'd only been on the First Circuit for a matter of months when he was nominated, but he certainly had a judicial and legal paper trail dating back to his time as, a judge and attorney general in New Hampshire. So if they really wanted evidence, they could find it, and perhaps some did, and, they didn't like what they saw. But overall, Suter was a confirmable and decent nominee who many people cheered as a home run for conservatives. Okay? So now, those who had cheered him as a conservative home run were going to be very disappointed very quickly. Now, David Suter, for many years was thus the poster child of, judges who are championed to be conservatives, but really are closet liberals. David Suter, once he got on the Supreme Court, yes, he was a solid conservative for about a year. And then by 1992, 2 years into his tenure on the court, he had effectively moved to the court center ideologically. And by 1995, just 5 years after his appointment, Justice Suter was an unquestionable member of the court's liberal wing. All right, which included, as well as Justice John Paul Stevens, as well as Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. All right, Suter was certainly no longer a judicial conservative after 1995. And, conservatives for years, like I said, afterwards, used him as the poster child of why you have to be exceptionally careful with nominees who don't have a paper trail. Ironically, some of the very same Democratic senators who had opposed Suter in 1990 would later come to love him. So it should have shown them, that a paper trail, or lack thereof, so to speak, isn't always conclusive. All right. If a judge lacks a paper trail, that might be a good thing. And they found that out with David Suter. All right. And by the time he retired in 2009, David Suter was a, firmly entrenched member of the court's left wing. All right. During his 19 years on the court, Suter was never, a quote unquote leader among the justices. He was a quiet, reserved man and, made his mark where he did. But, he was nothing like the man whom he replaced in terms of charting out great new paths for the law. Brennan was certainly a leader during his 34 years on the court, something Suter never was. All right. But Suter was a definite member of the court's liberal wing and hardly ever broke ranks with them after 1993, in truth. Okay? He was, respectful, got along with everybody, and had pledged in the very beginning that he didn't plan to stay in Washington forever, and he didn't. And his retirement at the age of 69 in June of 2009, was one of the youngest retirements in recent history from the Supreme Court. Most Supreme Court justices prefer to stay until they're, 80, 90 years old. But Suter stepping down at 69, that's almost unheard of today. All right. And of course, his retirement gave President Barack Obama his first opportunity at an appointment. And he, of course, chose Sonia Sotomayor, all right, our current Justice, Sonia Sotomayor, to replace David Suter, making her the first Latina member of the Supreme Court of the United States. All right. So that is Justice David Suter, President Bush's first appointment to the Supreme Court. Suter served from 1990 until his retirement in 2009. All right. So President Bush's second appointment, like I said, came in June of 1991 with the retirement of Justice Thurgood Marshall. Now, this was blockbuster. In June of 1991, Justice Thurgood Marshall decided to hang up his robe for good. All right. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Marshall's retirement in 91 was arguably facilitated by the retirement of Justice Brennan a year earlier. Indeed, Justice Marshall's health had been failing for many years before now in 1991. All right. And, but as long as Brennan was there, Marshall could remain safely in the background as Justice Brennan's loyal lieutenant, all right, as the second in command of the court's liberal wing. Marshall's physical and mental health had been in decline, like I said, for some years. And once Justice Brennan retired in 1990, it was now Marshall's job to step up to the plate and lead the court's left wing, something that he was not able to do in theory or in fact. All right. Marshall couldn't even fake the funk to do that. He was at this point 83 years old. Mind was failing, body was failing. So, he made a lot of mistakes during the court's 1990 and 91 term that exposed his true weakness. And even voting to, in one case during that term, to uphold a death sentence, something Marshall had never done on the Supreme Court, ever. So that definitely exposed Justice Marshall's failing mind. And, he figured it was best for him to step down now, as to, for the sake of his own health and to prevent any further embarrassment for himself and to the court, perhaps, indeed. But this was following 24 years of distinguished service. Not everybody, but if you are blessed with the privilege to reach your 80s, all right, 90s, 9 chances out of 10, you're probably going to be failing in some way. And Supreme Court justices are no different. Certainly true for both Brennan and Marshall. And certainly Marshall was very angry at Justice Brennan for stepping down a year earlier because Marshall also didn't want to retire under a Republican president. All right. As he knew that his successor was going to be somebody the whole opposite of himself. All right. So when Justice Marshall decided to step down from the court, President Bush ultimately, unlike with Brennan, he had 2 individuals in mind to replace Marshall. Of course, we already know one, Clarence Thomas, the judge on the D.C. Circuit at the time, and Judge Emilio Garza, all right, who was on the Fifth Circuit, all right. Now, speculations say that Bush's personal choice to replace Marshall would have been Judge Garza. However, he had just been appointed to the Fifth Circuit a few weeks before this. So, that looked kind of crazy. We just got him on the Fifth Circuit. Now you want to put him on the Supreme Court. So that ruled Garza out and thus leaving Thomas. All right. Now, Thomas, of course, we all know current Justice Clarence Thomas is a very, very conservative man, always has been. And, Thomas was, as Bush described, the best man for the job. which is a serious pronouncement, okay? You better be able to defend a statement like that, okay? To replace a legend like Thurgood Marshall, Bush called Thomas the best man for the job. So certainly during the course of his confirmation hearings, senators picked apart his mind to see where he stood on lots of subjects. He did the typical evasive answers like most Supreme Court nominees do without giving a solid, where I'm going to put my finger on this issue, But of course, as a judicial nominee, this is what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to say, I am in favor of this, I am against that, I am against the third. No, you're a judge. You're not an elected official, all right? Act like one. So with that in mind, Thomas, everything was going good, all right? That is until allegations arose by Thomas's former colleague, Anita Hill, that he had engaged in several acts of sexual harassment, all right? Hill made, these accusations against Thomas, while his confirmation hearings were going on, and this obviously interrupted the process substantially, and it turned into one of the most landmark shit shows in Supreme Court nomination history, arguably only rivaled by the Bork nomination a few years earlier in 1987 and the Kavanaugh nomination nearly 20 years later in 2018. Okay, I'm sorry, nearly 30 years later in 2018. So, this turned into a back and forth, from testimony between Thomas and Hill, it seemed, really, really questionable as to whether or not Thomas was telling the truth, whether or not Hill was telling the truth. Keep in mind, this is the early 1990s, and sexual harassment was not really something that could destroy your credibility or your life at that point. Think of it like, using, like, you being nominated to a federal appeals court today and they found out you had smoked marijuana. The Senate Judiciary Committee would be like, okay, whatever. It's amazing how times have changed, right? Now, back then, you could be accused of sexual harassment and they'd be like, okay, anything else? But let it be known that you had smoked marijuana or something, and they'd be like, oh, no, you are damaged goods, you got to go. Nowadays, you get accused of sexual harassment, your goose is cooked. You are done, even if there is no proof to support the accusation of the accuser. Yes, that's the world we live in now. But I'm not going to get into that. Back to the subject of this video. Ultimately, like I said, it turned into a nasty major league shit show that almost derailed Thomas's nomination to the court. All right. Ultimately, though, the Senate would confirm Thomas to a lifetime seat on the Supreme Court at the age of 43 on October 15th, 1991. All right. The vote to confirm Thomas was 52 to 48, one of the narrowest confirmation votes to date, all right, at that point. All right, so Thomas just made it through, all right, and he thus succeeded the legendary Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, Thomas would be the real home run for conservatives. Not only was he young, but he was truly committed to the cause. He was 43 years old and arguably could serve for decades, all right, which is exactly what has occurred. Justice Thomas has been an unwavering, consistent, and adamant conservative, originalist at that, since he became a Supreme Court justice in 1991, all right? I have special place for Justice Thomas, as Justice Thomas decided to allow me to talk with him and interview him, all right, so I could gain perspective, all right, from the court's only African-American justice serving and only its second African-American justice in history, all right. Our audience almost 20 years ago now was a very influential one, and I learned a lot from him. He's a very, unlike, how he's portrayed by the left-wing media, Justice Thomas is a very, very down-to-earth, humble, and almost somewhat intimidating kind of individual. He has a very commanding presence, okay? And he's someone who, if you ever did have the pleasure of talking with him in person, he would certainly command your attention and your respect. I have nothing but respect for him. Like I said, he is the only Supreme Court justice who ever wanted to meet me in person. Who am I? All right? Just an educator. All right? I had written to all 9 members of the court at the very beginning of 2004, just to get some advice and insight. Remember, at that time, I wanted to become a Supreme Court justice myself. So, I wanted some guidance from the justices. And a few of them responded: Kennedy, Breyer, and Thomas. Okay? Justice Kennedy wrote me a great letter. I appreciate that. Justice Breyer corresponded as well. But Justice Thomas wanted to meet me. And you're darn right, I went there and, met him in chambers. It was, a wonderful conversation. Great guy. Now, I don't always agree with every aspect of his jurisprudence, but I do respect his philosophy of constitutional originalism. It makes it very difficult for a judge to reach many of the conclusions that are reached from many Supreme Court decisions if originalism is applied. Constitutional originalism simply adheres to the original intent of the framers or the original meaning of the words in the document, even if you are not adhering to original intent. Okay, so Thomas is a whole 180 degrees different from his predecessor, Thurgood Marshall, as Justice Marshall was an outspoken liberal whose judicial philosophy can be summed up in one sentence: you do what you think is right, and you let the law catch up. Big difference from Justice Thomas's constitutional originalism. Indeed, the shift from Brennan to Suter, was not really much of a shift at all. But the shift from Marshall to Thomas, we went from here, to over here. Big difference, all right? And of course, Justice Thomas is still serving, as of the time of this video, on the Supreme Court of the United States. He will reach his 30-year anniversary as of October 2021, all right? He is currently the most senior member of the U.S. Supreme Court with nearly 30 years of service on that body, all right? And hopefully he will continue to serve for many years to come, as long as his health holds up. One could rightly argue that Justice Thurgood Marshall was not pleased to have Clarence Thomas as a replacement, but, that's the name of the game sometimes. You don't get to choose typically who succeeds you in office, which is why the Supreme Court justices strategically time their retirements. And Marshall himself, if he had only hung on for about another year and a half, President Clinton would have been able to name his successor, where he almost certainly would have gotten someone much more to his liking. And ironically, and as I've indicated in another video, if Marshall had stepped down under President Reagan, ironically, he probably would have gotten someone milder than Justice Thomas as well. All right. In the 80s, there weren't that many African-American conservatives, and Thomas was too young and too inexperienced, so he wouldn't have even been considered. So President Reagan would have had to nominate someone else, and he would have almost certainly been more moderate in viewpoint than Clarence Thomas. Okay, so those are President Bush's 2 nominees to the Supreme Court of the United States. All right, Justice David Suter, who served from 1990 until his retirement in 2009, and Justice Clarence Thomas, who was appointed in 1991 and is still serving to the present day at the time of this recording. All right, so any questions or controversies, you can leave them down below, and I'll be happy to answer them. All right, I appreciate all of you for listening. If you've made it this far, clearly you are someone who loves history, loves the Supreme Court, or both. All right, hopefully it's both. All right, never be limited in your love for the subject of history. All right, so thanks again. If you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so now. It would graciously be appreciated. Just hit that little red subscribe button up there. And we'll be in business. You'll get updates on my videos and, see every time I post something new and exciting like this. All right. And if you gained something from this video and you liked it, drop me a like. Also, before I go, got 2 book suggestions for you. First, Closed Chambers, all right, by Edward Lazarus. Gives you a lot of personal accounts of the inner workings of the U.S. Supreme Court. Mr. Lazarus was a law clerk to Justice Harry Blackmun during the 1988-89 term, all right? And in writing this book, he technically broke the unwritten code of silence for former law clerks. But I'm glad Mr. Lazarus did break that code of silence, because this book gives a lot of powerful testimony about just how things work at the court, the relationships among the clerks and everything else, among the justices. And I tell you, it can get wretched from time to time. So check this out, all right? And the next one is A People's History of the Supreme Court by Peter Irons, all right? And, this book gives you a powerful history of the Supreme Court as an institution, early American history, and the evolution of the court as an institution from the beginning to the present day. All right. So if you love American history, and you especially love the legal impact of, the courts, as well as the events that have shaped American legal history, you will definitely love this book. Again, it's called A People's History of the Supreme Court by Peter Irons. And this one, Closed Chambers, The Rise, Fall, and Future of the U.S. Supreme Court, all right, of the modern Supreme Court, rather, by Edward Lazarus. 2 great books about the Supreme Court. Supreme Court buff that I am, all right, I got loads more, all right. Check them out. You won't be disappointed. So take care, stay safe out there, and I'll talk to you at the next bite. Peace.